The massive space station rotated slowly against the backdrop of three different colored suns. Maya Torres pressed her palm against the cool metal wall of the corridor and felt the gentle vibration of the artificial gravity generators. She had been walking these same halls for 3 years now, attending the same meetings, hearing the same arguments, watching the same politicians promise peace while their fleets gathered for war. Today felt different, though. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Even the maintenance robots seemed to move more quietly through the corridors, as if they understood that something important was about to happen. Maya adjusted her uniform jacket and checked her reflection in the polished surface of a nearby door. At 47 years old, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had seen real combat before being transferred to diplomatic duty. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation style, and her brown eyes showed the kind of weariness that came from too many years of watching good people die for bad reasons. The conference room was already buzzing with activity when she arrived. The translation devices hummed constantly as delegates from dozens of different species tried to make themselves understood. The Krillian ambassador was clicking his mandibles in agitation while gesturing with all four of his arms. His species looked like a cross between a praying mantis and a spider, with chitinous armor that gleamed under the artificial lights. President Alara of the Villari Empire sat gracefully in her specially designed chair, her elongated limbs folded, with an elegance that made even simple movements look like a dance. The Villari were beautiful creatures, with silver skin that seemed to shimmer and large eyes that held depths of intelligence that sometimes made humans uncomfortable. They had been spacefaring for over 2,000 years. Long before humans had even discovered fire, the neutral mediators floated near the center of the room, beings of pure energy who called themselves the Ethereal Collective. They had given up physical form so long ago that most species considered them to be myths. Their presence at these talks was both an honor and a warning. The Ethereals only involved themselves when entire civilizations were at risk. Maya took her seat next to Admiral Reed, the head of the human delegation. Reed was a career military officer who had been pulled into diplomacy because of his reputation for keeping his cool under pressure. He nodded briefly at Maya, but his attention was focused on the holographic display showing the latest intelligence reports from the border systems. The reports were not encouraging. Military buildups on all sides, civilian shipping being rerouted through safer but longer paths, and an increasing number of incidents between patrol vessels. 3 months ago, a Krillian scout ship had fired on a human research vessel. 2 months ago, Villari forces had blockaded a human supply convoy for 6 hours before allowing it to pass. Last month, human marines had boarded and searched a Krillian freighter suspected of carrying weapons. Each incident was technically legal under the complex web of treaties and agreements that governed interstellar space. Each incident also brought them one step closer to open warfare. Maya had studied the history of interstellar conflicts during her training for diplomatic service. The pattern was always the same. First came the disputes over territory or resources, then the small incidents, each side claiming they were just defending their legitimate interests. Then someone would cross a line that could not be uncrossed, and millions of beings would die in the resulting war. The problem was that nobody ever seemed to learn from history. Each species was convinced that their cause was just their position reasonable, their enemies unreasonable. The Krillians believed that their collective consciousness gave them a better understanding of what was best for the galaxy. The Villari trusted in their ancient wisdom and spiritual insights. The humans relied on their adaptability and determination. All three species were probably right in their own way. All three species were also probably doomed. Ambassador Thex began the morning session with a formal complaint about human expansion into what the Krillians considered their territory. His voice came through the translators as a series of harsh clicks and buzzes, but the meaning was clear enough. Humans were spreading too fast, taking up too much space, disrupting the careful balance that had kept the galaxy peaceful for centuries. Admiral Reed responded with equal formality, pointing out that human colonies were established only on uninhabited worlds or planets. whose previous inhabitants had given clear consent for settlement. Every human expansion followed established protocols that had been agreed upon by all major powers. President Alara listened to both sides with the patience that came from living for over 300 years. When she finally spoke, her melodious voice carried the weight of ancient authority. The Villari Empire had concerns about human expansion as well, she said. Humans changed everything they touched, reshaping entire ecosystems to suit their needs. They built with a speed and scale that disrupted the natural order of things. Maya had heard all of these arguments before. She had participated in variations of the same conversation hundreds of times over the past 3 years. The aliens saw human expansion and assumed it was driven by the same impulses that drove their own species. They thought humans wanted more territory, more resources, more power. They were wrong. Humans were not expanding because they wanted to conquer the galaxy. They were expanding because they were terrified of extinction. Earth was still struggling to recover from the environmental collapse that had nearly wiped out human civilization 3 centuries ago. The home system could support perhaps 2 billion people at most, a fraction of the population that had once called Earth home. Every human colony was a backup plan. Every outpost was insurance against the possibility that something might happen, to cut them off from their supply lines. Every research station was the attempt to find new ways to keep their species alive in a universe that seemed determined to kill them, but explaining that to the aliens was almost impossible. How do you describe the terror of watching your homeworld die to species that had never faced that possibility? How do you make beings who had occupied the same territories for millennia understand the desperate need to spread out, to diversify, to never again put all your eggs in one basket? Maya looked around the conference room at the assembled delegates and felt a familiar sense of frustration. They were all intelligent beings, all capable of reason and compromise. But they were also all products of their own histories and cultures. The Krillians could not imagine existing without their collective consciousness binding them together. The Villari could not conceive of abandoning the spiritual centers that had guided them for thousands of years, and humans could not forget the lesson they had learned when Earth nearly died. Never again would they allow themselves to be vulnerable to extinction. Never again would they put their survival in the hands of a single world or a single system. The morning session ended with the usual promises to consider each other's positions and reconvene after lunch. Maya gathered her notes and followed Admiral Reed out of the conference room, knowing that tomorrow would bring more of the same arguments, the same misunderstandings, the same slow march toward a war that nobody wanted but everyone seemed powerless to prevent. She paused at one of the observation windows and looked out at the stars. Somewhere out there, human families were building new lives on distant worlds, never knowing that their right to exist was being debated by politicians and diplomats. Somewhere out there, Krillian hive ships were loading weapons and checking their targeting systems. Somewhere out there, Villari battle fleets were practicing maneuvers that would soon be used in actual combat. Maya Torres had seen war before. She knew what it looked like when civilizations decided that their differences could only be settled with violence. She also knew that once that decision was made, it was almost impossible to change course, but almost impossible was not the same as completely impossible. There was still time, still hope, still a chance that someone might find the words that could bridge the gap between species and prevent the galaxy from tearing itself apart. Maya just wished she knew what those words might be. The emergency klaxon pierced through the quiet hum of the space station's life support systems. Maya Torres was in her quarters reviewing intelligence reports when the alarm began its urgent wailing. She grabbed her jacket and ran toward the command center, her heart already sinking because she knew what kind of news warranted an emergency alert during peace negotiations. The command center was chaos when she arrived. Holographic displays showed real-time data feeds from monitoring stations throughout the disputed border regions. Admiral Reed stood in the center of it all, his face grim as he absorbed the incoming reports. The other human delegates were gathered around him, their expressions ranging from shock to anger to resignation. Maya pushed through the crowd to reach Reed's side. The main display showed the tactical situation in the Kepler-7 system, where 3 human transport vessels had been traveling toward the new Denver colony. 2 of the ships showed as destroyed, their transponder signals having gone dark less than an hour ago. The 3rd ship was badly damaged but still transmitting a weak distress signal. "Civilian vessels," Reed said without looking up from the display. 1,800 people, mostly families with children. The Krillians opened fire without warning. Maya felt her stomach drop. She had grown up on a colony world herself, arriving as a child with her parents who were seeking a better life among the stars. She knew these people, had been one of these people. They were not soldiers or politicians or diplomats. They were just ordinary humans trying to build a future for their families. "What's the official Krillian position?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. "They claim the transports were in violation of their territorial boundaries," Reed replied. "They say they issued warnings that were ignored." Maya studied the navigational data. The transport convoy had been following an established shipping lane that had been in use for over 20 years. The route had been approved by all major powers and was specifically designated for civilian traffic. If the Krillians wanted to change the status of that space, they should have gone through proper diplomatic channels. Instead, they had chosen to make their point with weapons. The implications were staggering. For decades, all sides had maintained the fiction that their disputes were political rather than military. They argued about boundaries and resources and territorial rights, but they did not shoot at each other's civilians. The destruction of the transport vessels represented a fundamental escalation that would be almost impossible to walk back from. Maya watched the data streams and tried to process what this meant for the peace talks. The negotiations had been difficult before, but they had still been negotiations. Both sides had been willing to talk, to compromise, to find some middle ground that would allow all 3 species to coexist in the same galaxy. Now, the Krillians had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. They had killed human civilians, including children, for the crime of traveling through space that humans considered to be neutral territory. Admiral Reed would have no choice but to demand justice, reparations, and guarantees that such attacks would never happen again. The Krillians would refuse, claiming that they were defending their legitimate territorial interests. The Velari would use the incident as proof that humans were too aggressive and expansionist for their own good. The peace talks would collapse, and within months the galaxy would be at war. Maya had seen this pattern before in her study of military history. Small incidents that escalated into larger conflicts, misunderstandings that became permanent grievances, fear and mistrust that grew until violence seemed like the only solution. The destruction of the transport vessels was exactly the kind of spark that could ignite a war between 3 major powers. She left the command center and walked back to her quarters, needing time to think. The corridor seemed different now, charged with a new kind of tension. Other delegates were hurrying between meetings, their faces showing the strain of trying to manage a crisis that was spiraling out of control. Maya's quarters were small but comfortable, with a single window that looked out at the stars. She had spent many hours at that window over the past 3 years, wondering if diplomacy would be enough to prevent the war that everyone could see coming. Now she was afraid she had her answer. She opened her personal files and pulled up the classified intelligence reports that Admiral Reed had shared with her. The military assessments were sobering. If war came, humanity would be fighting from a position of severe disadvantage. The Krillians had larger fleets and more advanced weapons technology. The Velari controlled key strategic positions that would allow them to cut human supply lines. More importantly, both alien species had stable populations centered around their homeworlds. They could absorb losses that would be catastrophic for humanity. Humans were spread across dozens of systems, dependent on complex supply chains and vulnerable to disruption. A sustained war would force them to abandon their outer colonies and concentrate their population in the core systems. The mathematics were brutal. Human military analysts estimated that their species had perhaps a 40 percent chance of survival if forced into a two-front war against both the Krillians and the Villari. Those odds dropped to less than 20% if the fighting lasted. More than 2 years, Maya closed the files and returned to the window. She thought about her daughter Emma, who was studying xenobiology at the University on Mars. Emma believed in the future of interstellar cooperation, in the possibility that different species could work together to explore the galaxy and unlock its secrets. She was part of a generation that had grown up with aliens as neighbors rather than enemies. What would happen to Emma's dreams if the galaxy descended into warfare? How many young humans like her would die in the fighting, and how many would never be born because their species had been driven to extinction? Maya had joined the diplomatic corps because she believed that words could be more powerful than weapons. She had seen what war could do during her time in the military, had watched good people die for causes that seemed less important once the shooting stopped. Diplomacy was slower and more frustrating than warfare, but it was also the only way to build lasting peace. Now she wondered if she had been naive. Perhaps some conflicts were too deep to be resolved through negotiation. Perhaps the differences between species were too fundamental to be bridged by compromise and understanding. The communication system in her quarters chimed with an incoming message. Maya activated the display and saw Admiral Reed's tired face. Looking back at her, "Emergency session in 1 hour," he said without preamble. "The Krillians are claiming that our transports were armed and posed a threat to their patrol vessels. They want to present evidence to support their position." Maya nodded. "What kind of evidence?" "Sensor data that supposedly shows weapon signatures from the lead transport," Reed replied. "It's probably fabricated, but we'll have to respond to it formally, and if we can prove it's fabricated." Reed was quiet for a moment. "Then we'll be calling them liars as well as murderers. That's not going to make the next round of negotiations any easier." The display went dark, leaving Maya alone with her thoughts. She understood the impossible position that Admiral Reed was in. If he accepted the Krillian claims, he would be abandoning the families who had died in the attack. If he challenged those claims directly, he would be escalating the conflict even further. Either way, the peace talks were almost certainly doomed. The destruction of the transport vessels had changed the fundamental dynamic of the negotiations. What had been a political dispute was now a blood feud, and blood feuds were notoriously difficult to resolve through diplomatic means. Maya returned to her desk and began preparing for the emergency session. She reviewed the technical specifications of the destroyed vessels, studied the navigational charts of the Kepler-7 system, and analyzed the timeline of events leading up to the attack. The evidence was clear to anyone who wanted to see it. The transports had been unarmed civilian vessels following an established flight path. The Krillian attack had been unprovoked and unjustified, but evidence only mattered if all parties were willing to accept it. Maya suspected that the Krillians had already decided on their version of events and would not be swayed by inconvenient facts. They needed to justify their actions, both to the galactic community and to their own people. The truth was that the Krillians were probably as frightened as everyone else. Their hive-mind society gave them certain advantages in coordination and planning, but it also made them vulnerable to disruption. Human expansion represented a threat to the careful balance that had kept their civilization stable for centuries. Fear made people do terrible things, and fear was driving all three species toward a war that none of them could afford to fight. The Krillians feared human expansion. The Villari feared the disruption of the ancient order. The humans feared extinction. Maya finished her preparations and headed back toward the conference room. The emergency session would probably accomplish nothing except to formalize the breakdown of diplomatic relations. But she had to try. She had to believe that there was still some way to pull back from the brink, some combination of words that could prevent the galaxy from tearing itself apart. She walked through the corridors of the neutral station, past delegates from dozens of different species who were all trying to manage the same crisis. The future of three civilizations hung in the balance, and Maya Torres was one of the few people in a position to influence the outcome. She just wished she knew how. The holographic evidence floated in the center of the conference room like an accusation. Ambassador Thex gestured at the sensor readings with two of his forearms while the other two manipulated the display controls. His mandibles clicked rapidly as he spoke, the translation devices converting his words into a dozen different languages simultaneously. These readings clearly show energy signatures consistent with military-grade weapon systems, Thex declared. The human vessels were not innocent transports as claimed. They were armed scouts probing our defensive positions. Maya studied the data carefully. She had enough technical training to understand what she was looking at, and something about the readings bothered her. The energy signatures were too clean, too perfectly aligned with known human weapon specifications. Real sensor data was always messy, full of interference and background noise that made interpretation difficult. Admiral Reed leaned forward in his chair, his jaw tight with controlled anger. Ambassador Thex, are you seriously suggesting that? We armed civilian transports with military weapons and sent them into disputed space as some kind of reconnaissance mission. I am suggesting nothing, Thex replied. I am stating facts based on objective sensor data collected by Krillian monitoring stations. President Alara had remained silent throughout the presentation, but Maya could see the calculation in her large silver eyes. The Villari leader was weighing the political implications of supporting either side's version of events. Her decision would likely determine whether the crisis could be contained, or would spiral into full-scale warfare. Maya activated her own holographic display and called up the technical specifications for the destroyed vessels. The Marcus Webb, the New Horizon, and the Pioneer's Dream had all been standard civilian transports, designed for moving people and cargo rather than fighting wars. Their hulls were lightly armored to protect against micrometeorite impacts, and their engines were optimized for fuel efficiency rather than combat maneuvers. Most importantly, none of the three ships had been equipped with weapons of any kind. Human civilian vessels were forbidden by law from carrying military hardware, and the prohibition was strictly enforced by regular inspections. The sensor readings are fabricated, Maya said quietly, her words cutting through the background murmur of translation devices. The room fell silent. Accusing another delegation of falsifying evidence was a serious breach of diplomatic protocol, the kind of statement that could end negotiations permanently. But Maya had studied the data carefully and was confident in her assessment. Ambassador Vex's compound eyes fixed on her with predatory intensity. Commander Torres, are you calling the Krillian collective liars? I'm calling these sensor readings inaccurate, Maya replied, meeting his gaze steadily. The energy signatures you've presented are too clean to be real sensor data. They look like computer simulations based on theoretical weapons specifications. She manipulated her own display to highlight the inconsistencies in the Krillian evidence. Real sensor readings include background interference, quantum fluctuations, and distortion from nearby stellar activity. Your data shows none of these. Natural variations, it's too perfect to be real. President Alara leaned forward with interest. The Villari had been spacefaring for thousands of years and understood sensor technology better than most species. If anyone could verify Maya's technical analysis, it would be Alara. Furthermore, Maya continued, the supposed weapon signatures appear at exactly the same intensity and frequency across all three vessels. In reality, even identical weapon systems show slight variations due to manufacturing tolerances and operational differences. Admiral Reed nodded approvingly. Maya had found the flaws in the Krillian evidence that he had suspected were there, but lacked the technical expertise to identify. The fabricated sensor data was skillfully done, but not perfect enough to fool a detailed analysis. Ambassador Thex's mandibles clicked in agitation. Commander Torres is attempting to distract from the real issue with technical nitpicking. The fact remains that human vessels violated Krillian territorial boundaries. The fact remains that you murdered 1,800 civilians, Admiral. Reed snapped, his diplomatic composure finally cracking, including 400 children who never threatened anyone in their lives. The raw emotion in Reed's voice seemed to affect even the ethereal mediators, whose luminous forms flickered with something that might have been sympathy. Guide Luminous spoke directly into everyone's minds, its mental voice carrying notes of deep sadness. The loss of innocent life is always tragic, regardless of the circumstances that led to it. The ethereal collective calls upon all parties to step back from rhetoric that increases rather than decreases tensions. Maya appreciated the mediator's attempt to calm the situation, but she could see that emotions were running too high for rational discussion. The destruction of the transport vessels had transformed a political dispute into something much more personal and dangerous. She thought about the intelligence reports she had reviewed earlier, the military buildups and fleet movements that indicated all three species were preparing for war. The Krillians were consolidating their hive ships at strategic jump points. The Villari were quietly repositioning their battle fleets to protect their core worlds. Human forces were taking defensive positions around the major colony systems. Everyone was preparing for a conflict that would devastate the galaxy. Yet here they sat arguing about sensor readings and territorial boundaries as if the real issues could be resolved through technical debates and legal precedents. Maya realized that the peace talks had become a ritual, a formal process that all sides went through before beginning the real business of warfare. The delegates were no longer trying to find solutions to their underlying problems. They were building cases to justify the military actions they had already decided to take. The afternoon session devolved into a series of accusations and counter-accusations. The Krillians insisted that human expansion represented an existential threat to their way of life. The humans demanded justice for the murdered civilians and guarantees that such attacks would not be repeated. The Villari listened to both sides while carefully avoiding any commitments that might draw them deeper into the conflict. Maya found herself thinking about her childhood on New Brisbane, one of the earliest human colony worlds. She remembered the stories her grandmother used to tell about the great exodus from Earth, when millions of humans had fled their dying homeworld in search of new places to live. Her grandmother had been part of the first wave of colonists, leaving behind everything she had ever known to build a new life on an alien world. She used to describe the terror of those early years, when failure meant not just personal loss but the possible extinction of the human species. We didn't have anywhere else to go, her grandmother had explained. Earth was dying and we couldn't fix it fast enough to save everyone. So we scattered to the stars like seeds on the wind, hoping that some of us would take root and grow. The memory gave Maya a new perspective on the current crisis. The aliens saw human expansion and assumed it was driven by greed or aggression, or a desire for political dominance. They compared human behavior to their own species' historical patterns and drew conclusions based on those comparisons. But humans were not expanding because they wanted to conquer the galaxy. They were expanding because they were still refugees from a dead world, still carrying the trauma of watching their birthplace become uninhabitable. Every new colony was insurance against extinction. Every outpost was a backup plan in case something went wrong with their existing settlements. Maya looked around the conference room at the assembled delegates and realized that none of them understood what was really at stake. The Krillians thought they were fighting human imperialism. The Villari believed they were defending the natural order from disruptive newcomers. Even Admiral Reed seemed to view the conflict primarily in terms of territorial disputes and political sovereignty. None of them recognized that humanity was fighting for its very survival as a species. The outer colonies were not conquests to be defended for reasons of pride or political advantage. They were lifelines that kept human civilization alive and growing. Losing them would mean retreating back toward the Sol system and the slow decline that would inevitably follow. Maya had studied the classified projections from the colonial administration. Without access to the resources and living space provided by the outer worlds, human population growth would stagnate and then reverse. Within a century, maybe two, the species would be facing extinction just as surely as if they had never left. Earth et al. The evening session ended with no progress toward resolution. If anything, positions had hardened as each side restated their grievances and demands. Maya walked back to her quarters feeling the weight of impending disaster. She stopped at the observation deck and looked out at the stars, wondering how many of them sheltered human families who had no idea that their right to exist was being debated by politicians and diplomats. How many children were growing up on distant worlds, never suspecting that their future depended on the outcome of negotiations taking place light years away? Maya had joined the diplomatic corps because she believed that understanding could overcome fear, that rational discussion could resolve even the deepest conflicts. But she was beginning to suspect that some problems were too fundamental to be solved through conventional diplomacy. The three species were operating from completely different assumptions about what the conflict was really about. Until they could agree on the nature of the problem, they had no hope of finding a solution that all sides could accept. Maya spent the night preparing for what might be the final session of the peace talks. Tomorrow, Admiral Reed would probably announce the withdrawal of the human delegation. Within weeks, the shooting would begin in earnest, and the galaxy would learn whether three advanced civilizations could coexist or would destroy each other in their fear and misunderstanding. She had one last chance to find the words that might bridge the gap between species and prevent a war that none of them could afford to fight. Maya Torres was just one person among billions, but sometimes one person speaking the right words at the right time could change the course of history. She just hoped she would recognize those words when the moment came to speak them, the second wave of emergency. Alerts began at 0347 station time, jerking Maya from an uneasy sleep. This time she did not bother with her uniform jacket. She threw on whatever clothes were closest and ran through the corridors toward the command center, her bare feet slapping against the cold metal deck plates. The scene in the command center was even more chaotic than the day before. Multiple holographic displays showed tactical data from 6 different star systems, all of them experiencing active combat. The symbols representing military vessels flashed red and orange as they engaged each other in deadly dance across light years of space. Admiral Reed stood in the center of the storm, coordinating with fleet commanders who were fighting battles in real time while he tried to manage a diplomatic crisis that was rapidly becoming irrelevant. His hair was disheveled and his eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep, but his voice remained steady as he issued orders and received status reports. "What's the situation?" Maya asked, pushing through the crowd of officers and analysts to reach Reed's side. "Full-scale shooting war," Reed replied without looking away from the displays. "Started about 3 hours ago when a Krillian battle group engaged our patrol squadron in the Vega system. Fighting has spread to 6 systems so far, with more battles developing every hour." Maya studied the tactical displays and felt her heart sink. The red symbols representing human forces were vastly outnumbered by the blue and green markers showing Krillian and Valari ships. Worse, the alien fleets were operating in coordinated groups while human forces were scattered across multiple systems, trying to defend too many positions with insufficient resources. "Casualties?" she asked, though she was afraid of the answer. 14 ships confirmed destroyed, another 8 reporting critical damage, Reed said quietly. "We're looking at roughly 3,000 dead so far, and the fighting is just getting started." Maya closed her eyes and tried to process the numbers. 3,000 human beings had died in the past few hours, their lives snuffed out in the cold vacuum of space while she slept peacefully in her quarters, aboard a neutral station. The peace talks had failed completely, and now the price of that failure was being paid in blood. She opened her eyes and looked at the tactical situation again. The pattern was becoming clear. The Krillians and Valari were not just defending their territories or responding to human aggression. They were conducting a coordinated campaign designed to drive humanity back to their core systems and eliminate them as a threat to galactic stability. The alien fleets were targeting supply lines, mining operations, and orbital infrastructure rather than population centers. They were trying to strangle human civilization economically rather than destroying it outright. The strategy was both more humane and more effective than simple genocide. If the aliens succeeded in cutting off the outer colonies from each other and from the Sol system, human civilization would collapse within a generation. The scattered settlements would become isolated outposts struggling to survive on their own, gradually failing as their technology broke down and their populations. Decline. Naya realized that she was witnessing the beginning of the end for her species. Not extinction through mass slaughter, but a slow strangulation that would be just as effective and much easier for the aliens to justify to themselves and to history. The Krillians have issued a statement, Reed continued, gesturing at one of the communication displays. They claim that human aggression forced them to take defensive action to protect their legitimate territorial interests. And the Villari? Silent for now, but their fleets are moving into attack positions throughout the disputed zones, Reed replied. President Alara is probably waiting to see how the initial battles develop before committing fully to the war. Maya understood the Villari strategy. Let the Krillians absorb the bulk of human military resistance while positioning Villari forces to deliver the decisive blow when human defenses were weakened. It was the kind of careful, long-term thinking that had kept the Villari Empire stable for thousands of years. The communication display chimed with an incoming priority message. Reed activated the channel and the image of Fleet Admiral Stevens appeared, her uniform scorched and her face grim with exhaustion. Admiral Reed, we need to withdraw from the outer systems, Stevens said without preamble. We're outnumbered 3-1 and taking casualties we can't replace. If we don't consolidate our forces soon, we won't have a fleet left to defend the core worlds. Reed nodded slowly. Maya could see the weight of command crushing down on him as he made decisions that would determine the fate of millions of people. How long can you hold the current positions? Maybe 48 hours if we're lucky, Stevens replied. The Krillians are bringing up reinforcements faster than we can organize our defenses. They've been planning this offensive for months, maybe years. The transmission ended, leaving Reed staring at the tactical displays with the expression of a man watching his civilization die. Maya had seen that look before during her military service. It was the face of a commander who understood that all of his options were bad, and that choosing the least terrible course of action would still result in enormous loss of life. She left the command center and walked back toward her quarters, needing time to think. The corridors of the neutral station seemed different now, charged with the knowledge that the peace talks had failed completely, and that 3 civilizations were now committed to destroying each other. Other delegates moved through the halls, with the uncertain gait of people who no longer understood their purpose. The Krillian and Villari representatives were probably receiving updates from their military commands and planning their next diplomatic moves. The neutral mediators were likely trying to figure out whether there was any possibility of arranging a ceasefire. Maya doubted that anyone would be interested in stopping the war now. Too much blood had been spilled, too many commitments made, too many bridges burned. The momentum of conflict had taken over, and momentum was a powerful force that was difficult to redirect once it built up sufficient energy. She reached her quarters and activated the communication system, connecting to the encrypted channel. That would reach her daughter Emma on Mars. The transmission delay was only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity before Emma's face appeared on the display. "Mom, what's wrong?" Emma asked immediately, her young face showing concern at the unusual timing of the call. "There's been some trouble with the negotiations," Maya said carefully. She could not reveal classified information about the military situation, but she needed to warn her daughter that dangerous times were coming. "How much trouble?" Emma pressed. She was studying xenobiology, but she also read the news and understood galactic politics better than many people twice her age. "Enough that you should consider accelerating your studies and moving closer to Earth," Maya replied. "The outer systems might become unsafe for civilians in the near future." Emma's eyes widened with understanding. She had grown up hearing stories about the great exodus from Earth and the constant struggle to establish human civilization among the stars. If her mother was suggesting that the colonies might become unsafe, it meant that humanity's survival as a spacefaring species was in question. "Mom, are we going to be okay?" Emma asked quietly. Maya looked at her daughter's face and felt her heart break a little. Emma represented everything that was best about humanity's future among the stars. She was intelligent, curious, optimistic about the possibility of peaceful coexistence with alien species. She deserved to grow up in a galaxy where different civilizations could work together to explore the universe and unlock its secrets. Instead, she would inherit a galaxy torn apart by war, where fear and misunderstanding had triumphed over reason and cooperation. "I don't know," Maya admitted. "But we're going to do everything we can to make sure that we are." The transmission ended, leaving Maya alone with her thoughts and fears. She walked to the window and looked out at the stars, wondering which ones. We're already witnessing battles between human and alien fleets. How many more people would die before the war finally ended? How many worlds would be destroyed? How many civilizations crippled or eliminated entirely? Maya had spent 3 years trying to prevent this exact scenario. She had attended hundreds of meetings, written thousands of reports, participated in countless negotiations designed to find peaceful solutions to the growing tensions between species. All of that effort had been wasted because nobody had been willing to look past their own fears and assumptions to understand what was really driving the conflict. The humans feared extinction and responded by expanding as rapidly as possible to ensure their species' survival. The aliens feared human expansion and responded by trying to contain it through political pressure and military force. Each side's defensive measures appeared aggressive to the other side, creating a spiral of mistrust that had finally erupted into open warfare. Maya returned to her desk and began drafting what might be her final report as a diplomatic officer. If the war continued to escalate, the peace talks would be formally suspended and all diplomatic personnel would be recalled to help with the war effort. Her years of experience in interspecies relations would be put to use analyzing alien tactics and predicting enemy behavior rather than seeking common ground and mutual understanding. The irony was bitter. Everything she had learned about alien psychology and culture would now be used to help kill aliens more efficiently rather than to build bridges between civilizations. The knowledge that could have prevented the war would instead be used to prosecute it more effectively. A soft chime indicated an incoming message on her personal communication system. Maya activated the display and saw the face of her old mentor, Professor Williams, who had taught her xenopsychology during her diplomatic training. "Maya, I've been following the news about the peace talks," Williams said, his elderly face showing deep concern. "Is there anything that can still be done to prevent this war?" Maya considered the question carefully. "I don't think so, Professor. The shooting has already started and casualties are mounting on all sides. The political momentum is all in favor of military solutions now. But you're still there," Williams pointed out. "The talks haven't been officially terminated yet. There might still be an opportunity to find some way forward." "What could I possibly say that would make a difference at this point?" Maya asked. "The aliens think we're aggressive expansionists who need to be contained. We think they're trying to drive us to extinction. Neither side is wrong from their own perspective." Williams was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "Maya, do you remember what I taught you about the fundamental attribution error?" Maya nodded. The fundamental attribution error was the tendency to attribute other people's behavior to their character while attributing your own behavior to circumstances. It was one of the most common sources of misunderstanding in interspecies relations. The aliens see human expansion and assume it's driven by greed or aggression because that's what expansion means in their own cultures. Williams continued, "But what if you could help them understand that human expansion is actually driven by fear? Not fear of them specifically, but fear of extinction itself?" "They wouldn't believe it," Maya replied. "Humans are one of the most successful spacefaring species in the galaxy. We have colonies and dozens of systems and a growing population. From their perspective, we're the opposite of endangered. Are we, though?" Williams asked gently. "Maya, what would happen to humanity if we lost access to the outer colonies? What would happen if we were forced back into the Sol system?" Maya had studied the projections. Without the resources and living space provided by the colonial worlds, human civilization would enter terminal decline within a few generations. The species would survive, but only as a shadow of what it had become during the Great Expansion. We'd be finished as a spacefaring civilization, she admitted. Maybe not extinct, but reduced to a single system species with no room for growth. And the aliens don't understand that, William said. They see our current strength and assume we're secure. They don't realize that our expansion is actually a desperate attempt to avoid the fate that nearly befell us on Earth. Maya felt something stirring in her mind, the beginning of an idea that might offer a way forward. What if the fundamental problem with the peace talks was that nobody understood what the other sides were really fighting for? What if humans, Krillians, and Valari were all responding to existential fears that the other species couldn't recognize or comprehend? Professor, what do you know about Krillian social psychology? She asked. What drives their expansion and territorial behavior? William smiled, recognizing that she was beginning to see the larger pattern. The Krillian collective consciousness is actually quite fragile. Their entire civilization depends on maintaining the psychic connections between their hive ships. They're terrified of anything that might disrupt those connections or force them to fragment into smaller groups. And the Valari? Deeply conservative species that value stability above almost everything else. They've maintained the same basic social structure for thousands of years. Rapid change of any kind threatens their sense of identity and purpose. Maya began to understand. The Krillians weren't trying to stop human expansion because they wanted more territory for themselves. They were afraid that human colonization patterns would disrupt the careful balance that kept their collective consciousness stable. The Valari weren't opposing humanity out of territorial greed, but because human adaptability and rapid technological development represented a threat to the unchanging order that defined their civilization. All three species were fighting for their survival, but they were defining survival in completely different terms. Humans needed room to expand and grow. Krillians needed stability and predictability. Valari needed continuity and tradition. Maya, there might still be time, William said urgently. If you could help each side understand what the others are really afraid of, you might be able to find a solution that addresses everyone's core needs. The communication ended, leaving Maya alone with a growing sense of possibility. The war had begun, but it was still in its early stages. If she could find the right words, if she could make the alien delegates understand what was really at stake for all three species, there might still be a chance to pull back from the brink. Maya spent the rest of the night preparing for what would probably be her last opportunity to prevent the complete collapse of interstellar civilization. Tomorrow's session would likely be the final meeting of the peace talks before all diplomatic relations were suspended in favor of military action. She had perhaps 12 hours to find a way to bridge the gap between three species, who had spent decades misunderstanding each other's fundamental motivations. It seemed impossible, but impossible odds had never stopped humanity before. Maya. Torres was just one person, but sometimes one person with the right perspective could change the course of history. She intended to find out whether this was one of those times. The final session of the peace talks convened under the shadow of continued warfare. Fresh casualty reports arrived every hour as human and alien fleets clashed across multiple star systems. The conference room felt more like a wake than a diplomatic gathering, with delegates going through the motions of negotiation while everyone understood that the real decisions were now being made by military commanders rather than politicians. Maya Torres sat in her usual seat beside Admiral Reed, but her mind was focused on the conversation she had shared with Professor Williams the night before. She had spent hours analyzing the psychological profiles of the alien species, looking for patterns and connections that previous negotiators had missed. The breakthrough had come just before dawn, when she realized that fear was the common thread, binding all three civilizations together. Not fear of each other specifically, but deeper existential fears that shaped how each species viewed the galaxy and their place in it. Ambassador Vex was presenting the Krillian position on post-war territorial arrangements, his forearms gesturing at holographic maps that showed the galaxy divided into neat spheres of influence. His species had clearly been planning for this conflict for years, developing detailed proposals for how to manage human territories after their military defeat. President Alara listened with the patience of someone who had lived for centuries and understood that most conflicts were temporary disruptions in the larger flow of history. The Villari leader showed no emotion as Vex described the fate that awaited human colonies once they were brought under alien administration. Admiral Reed responded with the formal dignity expected of a military officer representing his species in its darkest hour. He rejected the Krillian proposals and restated humanity's position that their expansion was legal and necessary for their survival as a spacefaring civilization. Maya listened to the familiar arguments and felt a growing sense of urgency. The delegates were talking past each other just as they had for 3 years, each side locked into positions that made compromise impossible. If she was going to act, it had to be now. Before the session ended and all diplomatic contact was suspended indefinitely. The moment came during a brief recess when the alien delegates were conferring among themselves, and Admiral Reed was reviewing military updates from the front lines. Maya rose slowly from her chair, the simple action somehow drawing the attention of everyone in the room. The conference chamber fell silent as she stood there, her hands clasped behind her back in a military posture that conveyed both respect and determination. She looked directly at Ambassador Vex, then at President Alara, then at the shimmering form of Guide Luminous representing the neutral mediators. "I need to tell you something," Maya said quietly, her voice carrying clearly. In the sudden stillness, "Something that we should have discussed 3 years ago, but didn't because we were all too afraid to admit what we were really fighting about." Admiral Reed looked at her sharply, recognizing that she was about to go off script in a way that could either save the negotiations or destroy them completely. Maya met his gaze briefly and saw understanding there. He trusted her judgment, even if he didn't know what she was planning to say. "You think you're fighting human expansionism," Maya continued, addressing the alien delegates directly. "You see our colonies spreading across the galaxy, and you assume we're driven by the same impulses that drive your own species when they expand: greed, territorial ambition, the desire for political dominance." She began walking slowly around the conference table, her movement creating a sense of intimacy that drew everyone into her words. "But you're wrong about what motivates us. Human expansion isn't driven by greed or ambition, it's driven by terror." Ambassador Vex's mandibles clicked in skepticism. "Terror of what?" "Your species controls dozens of systems and commands significant military resources." Maya stopped walking and faced him directly. "Terror of extinction, Ambassador. Terror of watching our species die the way our homeworld nearly died 3 centuries ago." She gestured toward the holographic display that still showed the tactical situation in the war zones. "Every human colony, every outpost, every research station is a backup plan. We spread across the galaxy because we learned on Earth that putting all your eggs in one basket is how species become extinct." The room was completely silent now. Even the background hum of the translation devices seemed muted as Maya continued speaking. "We didn't leave Earth because we wanted to conquer the stars. We left because our planet was dying and we couldn't save it fast enough to prevent massive population loss. 12 billion people lived on Earth when the environmental collapse began. Less than 2 billion live there now, and that's after 3 centuries of restoration efforts." She turned to President Alara. "Your species has occupied the same core worlds for thousands of years. You've never had to abandon your sacred places or watch your children grow up as refugees on alien worlds. You can't understand what it means to know that your entire civilization exists only because your ancestors were willing to flee into the unknown rather than die with their homeworld." President Alara's silver eyes showed something that might have been surprise. The Villari had extensive historical records, but they had apparently never fully grasped the psychological impact of humanity's exodus from Earth. Maya returned to her original position but remained standing. "You want to know why we fight so desperately for territory that seems insignificant to you? Because we've already lost one world. We've already watched our birthplace become uninhabitable. We know what extinction looks like, and we've sworn never to see it again. She gestured toward the ongoing battle reports. This isn't a war about territorial expansion or resource allocation. This is a war about whether humanity survives as a spacefaring species or retreats back to the Sol system, to die slowly over the next few centuries. Ambassador Thex was the first to respond, his voice carrying less certainty than usual. Even if what you say is true, it does not justify the disruption your expansion causes to established civilizations. Doesn't it? Maya asked gently. Ambassador, what do you know about Krillian psychology? About the fears that drive your own species? Vex's compound eyes fixed on her with sudden wariness. This was not the direction he had expected the conversation to take. Your collective consciousness is remarkable, Maya continued. The ability to coordinate thousands of individual minds into a unified whole has allowed your species to achieve things that individual-minded races can barely comprehend. But it's also fragile, isn't it? She had studied the classified intelligence reports on Krillian society. Your entire civilization depends on maintaining the psychic connections between your hive ships. Disruption of those connections would fragment your people into isolated groups, destroying the collective that defines your identity as a species. Vex's mandibles clicked nervously. Maya had touched on one of the deepest fears of Krillian. Civilization? Human expansion patterns create interference with your psychic networks, Maya said. Our colonies disrupt the quantum fields that your collective consciousness depends on. You're not trying to stop us because you want our territory. You're trying to stop us because our presence threatens the very foundation of your civilization. She turned to President Alara. And the Velari Empire faces its own existential challenge. Your species has maintained the same basic social structure for millennia. Stability and continuity are not just political preferences for you, they're psychological necessities. President Alara leaned forward with interest, her expression showing that Maya had her full attention. Human adaptability terrifies you, Maya continued. We change constantly, adapting to new environments and developing new technologies at a pace that must seem reckless to a species that values tradition and stability above all else. Our expansion represents more than territorial competition. It represents the possibility that the entire galactic order could be transformed in ways that would leave the Velari Empire obsolete. The conference room was completely silent now. Maya had laid bare the fears that drove all three species, the existential terrors that none of them had been willing to acknowledge openly. So here we are, Maya said quietly. Three civilizations, each fighting for their survival as they understand it. Humans terrified of extinction, Krillians afraid of fragmentation, Velari fearful of obsolescence. We've been trying to negotiate territorial boundaries when what we really need to negotiate is how three different types of consciousness can coexist in the same galaxy. She sat down slowly, her simple action carrying as much weight as her words. The war that's happening right now won't solve any of our fundamental problems. Even if one side achieves total victory, the underlying fears will remain. The only way forward is to find solutions that address everyone's core needs. Guide Luminous pulsed with a brightness that indicated deep consideration. Commander Torres speaks wisdom that the ethereal collective recognizes. Fear is indeed the root of this conflict, but fear acknowledged can become fear transcended. Ambassador Thex was quiet for a long moment before speaking. If what you say about human expansion is true, if your species truly faces extinction without access to the outer colonies, then the Krillian collective has been responding to a misunderstood threat. President Alara nodded slowly. The Velari Empire has also perhaps misinterpreted human intentions. If your adaptability is driven by necessity rather than aggression, it changes the nature of the challenge you represent. Admiral Reed looked at Maya with something approaching awe. She had done what 3 years of formal negotiations had failed to accomplish. She had made all sides understand what they were really fighting about. The question now, Maya said quietly, is whether we can find a way forward that ensures human survival without threatening Krillian unity or Velari stability. It won't be easy, but it's possible if we're all willing to acknowledge what we're really afraid of. The peace talks didn't end when Maya Torres stood up. They began again, with all sides finally understanding what was truly at stake. The war continued for several more days while diplomats worked frantically to negotiate a ceasefire, but the fundamental dynamic had changed. For the first time in 3 years, all three species were talking about solutions instead of just defending their positions. And sometimes when people finally understand what they're really fighting about, they can find ways to stop fighting and start building something better together. Maya Torres had stood up at exactly the right moment and said exactly the right words. The galaxy would remember that moment as the turning point when three civilizations chose understanding over fear, cooperation over conflict, and hope over despair. The peace talks finished when she stood up, but peace itself was just beginning.